On the 28th of April 1945, in a hastily constructed prisoner processing camp outside the shattered remains of Mannheim, Germany, auxiliary communications helper Greta Hoffmann stood in a line of captured German women, convinced she was about to face monsters who would devour her alive. She had never actually seen a black person before, only the caricatures plastered across every propaganda poster in her homeland for the past 12 years. What she believed about human nature, about superiority and inferiority, about the very structure of civilization itself, would completely dissolve within the next 72 hours through the simplest of human gestures. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a moment of unexpected human contact between people who had been taught to hate each other transformed not just individual lives, but challenged the very foundation of an ideology built on separation and fear. It is about how touch, the most basic form of human connection, proved more powerful than years of carefully constructed lies. Private First Class James Washington of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company had driven supply convoys for 19 months across France and into Germany, transporting ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies to frontline units while facing the same dangers as combat soldiers, but receiving none of the recognition. He had survived artillery barrages, air attacks, and the bitter winter of 1944. He had watched friends die on muddy roads. He had kept entire divisions supplied through sheer determination and skill. And yet, when his unit was temporarily assigned to assist with prisoner processing in late April 1945, he found himself facing something he had not fully prepared for: the raw, visceral terror in the eyes of German civilians who looked at him as if he were something less than human. Washington was 23 years old, from Montgomery, Alabama, where he had worked at his father's carpentry shop before being drafted in 1943. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, with broad shoulders developed from years of physical labor. His hands were calloused from both carpentry and military service. He wore the standard olive drab uniform of the United States Army, with his division patch sewn carefully on his shoulder by his own hand. He had kind eyes, though they often held a weariness that came from being perpetually treated as inferior in the very army he served. The 666th was one of several all-black quartermaster truck companies that had earned the nickname the Red Ball Express, though Washington's specific unit had actually served on similar but lesser-known supply lines. These companies had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to advancing Allied forces in the months following the invasion of Normandy. They had driven through the night without lights, navigated bombed-out roads, repaired vehicles under fire, and kept the momentum of the liberation going when it might otherwise have stalled. And they had done all of this while being segregated from white units, eating in separate mess halls, sleeping in separate quarters, and being denied entry to recreation facilities designated for white soldiers only. Corporal Thomas Mitchell, Washington's closest friend in the unit, stood beside him as they watched a column of German prisoners being marched into the processing area. Mitchell was from Detroit, Michigan, where he had worked in an automobile factory before the service. He was shorter than Washington, stockier, with quick hands and a sharp mind for mechanics. He could repair almost any vehicle with minimal tools, a skill that had saved their lives more than once. Mitchell had a wife and a young daughter back home, and he carried their photograph in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. The third member of their immediate group was Private Robert Hayes, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who at 28 was older than most privates. Hayes had attended 2 years of college before financial necessity had forced him to leave and find work. He wore glasses that he cleaned constantly, a nervous habit that revealed his anxious nature. Hayes was the one who wrote letters for other soldiers who struggled with literacy, and he kept a detailed diary of their experiences, filling 3 notebooks with his small, precise handwriting. The prisoner processing camp had been established in what had once been a German military training facility. The buildings were mostly intact, though one barracks had taken a direct hit from artillery and stood as a skeletal reminder of the recent conflict. The Americans had arrived just 4 days earlier. As the rapid Allied advance meant that thousands of German military personnel were being captured faster than the regular POW system could process them. Temporary camps like this one sprang up across Western Germany, staffed by whatever units happened to be available. Captain Robert Jensen, a white officer from Iowa who commanded the provisional unit to which Washington's company had been attached, had briefed them that morning. Jensen was a veteran of the North African campaign, a fair man by the standards of the time, which meant he treated his black soldiers with basic human decency rather than open contempt. He had fought against the assignment initially, not because he doubted their capability, but because he understood the complicated dynamics that would emerge. Captain Jensen told them that among the approximately 800 prisoners expected to arrive over the next several days would be around 150 women who had served in various auxiliary roles for the German armed forces during the conflict. These women had not been combat soldiers, but they had served as communication specialists, clerical workers, searchlight operators, and in various support functions that had freed men for frontline duty. Under the Geneva Convention, they were to be treated as prisoners and processed accordingly, though separate facilities would be maintained. Jensen had paused during the briefing, choosing his words carefully. He acknowledged that many of these prisoners would have been exposed to propaganda about African Americans, propaganda that portrayed them as dangerous savages. He told his men to expect fear, hostility, and possibly incidents that would test their professionalism. He emphasized that they were to conduct themselves as representatives of the United States Army and of American values, treating all prisoners with the respect required by international law, regardless of how they themselves might be treated in return. What Jensen did not say, but what every black soldier in that room understood, was the profound irony of their situation. They were liberators who returned home to segregation. They were defenders of democracy who could not vote in much of their own country. They were soldiers fighting against a regime built on racial supremacy while serving in an army that enforced racial separation. And now they would be face to face with people who had been taught the same lies about racial hierarchy that structured their own lives back home, except these lies had been even more extreme, even more violent in their implementation. The first column of German prisoners arrived at 1400 hours that afternoon. They came in trucks, packed tightly, exhausted and frightened. The men were separated from the women immediately, directed to different processing areas. The women numbered 43 in this first group, ranging in age from 18 to perhaps 45. They wore various uniforms, some the grey-blue of communications auxiliaries, others the standard Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, all dirty and worn from days of retreat and confusion, as the German military structure had collapsed around them. Greta Hoffmann was among them. She was 24 years old, from Munich, where she had worked as a telephone operator before volunteering for the auxiliary service in 1942. She had spent most of the conflict at communication centers well behind the lines, routing messages and maintaining equipment. She was tall, thin, with blonde hair cut short for practicality. Her hands showed the marks of someone who had worked with communication equipment, small scars from wire cuts, slight calluses from handling tools. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and fear. Beside her stood Margarete Schiller, 19 years old, from a small village near Stuttgart. Schiller had been assigned to a searchlight battery, operating the communications equipment that coordinated air defenses. She was shorter, rounder, with dark hair and blue eyes that were currently wide with terror. She kept her hands clutched together in front of her, knuckles white from the pressure. She had seen her first black American soldier 15 minutes earlier, and she had nearly fainted from fear. The third woman whose story would become central to this narrative was Helene Brandt, at 32 the oldest of the three. Brandt had served as a senior communications specialist, coordinating multiple auxiliary units. She was from Berlin, educated, from a middle-class family that had initially opposed the regime, but had gradually been worn down by pressure and circumstance. Brandt had a sharper mind than most, more education, more capacity for critical thought. But even she had absorbed the propaganda, the constant drumbeat of racial ideology that had permeated every aspect of life in Germany for 12 years. The women were directed into a large room that had once served as a dining facility. Tables and benches remained, though many showed damage. Windows high on the walls let in afternoon light that seemed too bright after the darkness of the transport trucks. American soldiers, all black, stood at intervals around the room, maintaining order, but not threatening. The women huddled together instinctively, seeking comfort in numbers. Washington watched from his position near the door as the women filed in. He saw their fear, recognized it immediately. He had seen variations of that fear before, in French villages during the early days after liberation, in the eyes of white officers who did not want to acknowledge his competence, in the faces of German civilians in recently captured towns. But this fear was different, more primal. These women genuinely believed they were in mortal danger. A German-speaking American officer, Lieutenant David Hoffman, a Jewish soldier from New York, whose parents had emigrated from Germany in 1936, stood at the front of the room. Hoffman's German was fluent, with a slight Berlin accent. He explained in clear, firm tones that the women were prisoners under the protection of the United States Army and the Geneva Convention. They would be treated correctly. They would receive food, water, medical attention, and shelter. They would be questioned about their service and then processed for eventual repatriation. No harm would come to them if they cooperated. The words seemed to bounce off a wall of terror. The women heard the sounds but could not connect them to meaning. Years of propaganda had prepared them for this moment, but the preparation had consisted entirely of lies designed to produce exactly this level of fear. They had been told that black soldiers were criminals released from American prisons, that they were savage, that they committed unspeakable acts, that they were barely human. And now, they were surrounded by exactly the men they had been taught to fear more than death itself. Greta Hoffman found herself trembling uncontrollably. She tried to hide it, tried to maintain some dignity, but her body would not obey. She had been awake for nearly 40 hours, had eaten almost nothing for 2 days, and her mind was overwhelmed by exhaustion and terror in equal measure. She looked at the American soldiers stationed around the room and tried to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught. They stood calmly, professionally, their uniforms clean and well-maintained. They did not leer or threaten. They simply stood there doing their jobs. It made no sense to her. Lieutenant Hoffman continued speaking, explaining the processing procedures. The women would be divided into smaller groups. They would fill out forms documenting their service, their rank, their units. They would undergo medical examinations to ensure they had no serious injuries or illnesses. They would receive clean clothing and basic toiletries. They would be housed in secured barracks with adequate facilities. The tone was businesslike, almost boring in its bureaucratic precision. Washington was assigned to escort one group of 15 women to the medical processing area. This was standard procedure. Every prisoner received a basic medical examination to document their condition and ensure no communicable diseases entered the camp population. A female army nurse would conduct the actual examinations, but male soldiers were needed to maintain security and assist with organization. Washington had done similar work before with male prisoners, where the dynamic had been hostile but straightforward. This felt different, more complicated. He approached the group he was assigned to escort, which included Hoffman, Schiller, and Brandt. He spoke in English, calmly and clearly, knowing they probably did not understand but hoping his tone would convey non-threat. "Move this way, please," he said, gesturing toward the door that led to the medical facility. The women did not move. They pressed together more tightly, as if physical proximity could protect them. Schiller started crying silently, tears running down her face without sound. Brandt put an arm around the younger woman's shoulders, her own face set in rigid determination to show no fear even as her body contradicted her with visible shaking. Lieutenant Hoffman hurried over, translated Washington's instruction. The women still hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, began to move. They gave Washington the widest possible berth, pressing against the far side of the doorway as they passed him. The fear radiated from them in waves that were almost physical in their intensity. The walk to the medical facility was only about 50 yards across an open area between buildings, but it felt like miles. Washington maintained his distance, understanding that his proximity increased their panic. He kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, everything about his body language designed to communicate safety. Mitchell, who had been assigned to assist, walked on the other side of the group, maintaining the same careful distance. "These ladies are scared out of their minds," Mitchell said quietly. "Can you blame them?" Washington replied. "You see what they've been told. You think touching us would actually kill them. Like they believe that." "Some of them probably do," Washington said. "Fear makes people believe all kinds of things." The medical facility had been set up in what had once been the training facility's infirmary. It had examination rooms, basic equipment, and adequate space. Captain Sarah Martinez, an Army nurse from Texas, was the primary medical officer on duty. Martinez was experienced, having worked in field hospitals since the North African campaign. She was efficient, compassionate, and completely uninterested in prisoners' ideological beliefs. She cared about medical conditions, nothing else. Martinez had been briefed about the situation and had prepared accordingly. She had set up examination areas with screens for privacy, had laid out clean hospital gowns, and had organized her supplies with characteristic precision. What she had not prepared for was the sheer depth of terror she encountered when the first group of German women entered her facility. A medical corpsman who spoke German, Sergeant Michael Bauer, another soldier whose family had fled Germany before the conflict, attempted to explain the examination procedures. Each woman would go behind a screen, remove her uniform, put on a hospital gown, and then be examined by Captain Martinez. The examination would check for injuries, infections, malnutrition, and general health status. It was routine, non-invasive, and would take approximately 10 minutes per person. Schiller collapsed. She simply folded at the knees and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The women around her cried out, several screaming. The room erupted into chaos. Washington moved instantly, his training taking over. He reached Schiller in 3 long strides, dropped to his knees beside her, and checked her breathing and pulse with practiced efficiency. He had received basic medical training, as all soldiers in support units did, and he could see immediately that she had fainted from exhaustion and fear, nothing more serious. "She is all right," he called out, "just fainted. She needs water and rest." But his words were lost in the pandemonium. The German women saw only a black man kneeling over their fallen comrade, and their terror transformed into something approaching hysteria. Brandt screamed at him in German, words he did not understand but whose meaning was clear. "Get away from her. Do not touch her. Leave her alone." Captain Martinez pushed through the crowd, her medical authority overriding everything else. She knelt beside Washington, made her own quick assessment, and confirmed his diagnosis. "She fainted," Martinez said firmly. "That is all. We need to get her elevated. Get some water. Let her recover." Washington and Martinez worked together, lifting Schiller carefully and carrying her to one of the examination tables. They laid her down gently, elevated her feet with folded blankets, and Martinez dampened a cloth to wipe her face. The other German women watched in stunned silence, their expectations shattered by the efficiency and care they witnessed. Schiller came to slowly, confused and disoriented. She looked up and saw Washington's face above her, close enough that she could see the concern in his eyes, the humanity there. For just a moment, before the propaganda reasserted itself, she saw him as simply another person trying to help her. Then fear flooded back and she tried to scramble away. "Easy, easy," Martinez said, holding her shoulder gently. "You are safe. You fainted. Just stay still for a minute." Bauer translated and Schiller slowly calmed. She looked from Martinez to Washington and back again, trying to process what had happened. This black soldier, this supposed monster, had helped her, had touched her with gentle, careful hands, had shown concern for her well-being. It did not match anything she had been taught, and the cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. The examination process continued, though at a slower pace than Martinez had planned. Each woman was handled with professionalism and respect. Martinez maintained a running commentary in English, translated by Bauer, explaining every step of what she was doing and why. She found various minor ailments, malnutrition in several cases, exhaustion in all cases, but nothing requiring immediate major medical intervention. Washington and Mitchell remained in the facility, available if needed, but staying out of the examination areas to preserve the women's privacy. They stood near the door, talking quietly, checking equipment, doing the routine tasks of soldiers on duty. The German women, waiting their turn for examination, watched them with a confusion that slowly began to displace some of the terror. Hoffman, waiting on a bench, found herself observing Washington more carefully. She noticed how he moved with calm confidence, how he spoke respectfully to Martinez, how his hands handled clipboards and supplies with the same competence any soldier might show. He laughed at something Mitchell said, a warm, genuine laugh that transformed his face. He looked tired, she realized. Not dangerous, not savage, just tired like everyone else in this exhausted spring of 1945. The examinations took 4 hours for the 15 women. By the end, the terror had diminished to wariness, which was progress. Captain Martinez completed her paperwork, documenting each woman's condition with thorough detail. She noted the malnutrition, the exhaustion, the minor injuries and ailments. She recommended increased rations, rest, and follow-up examinations in 1 week. As the women were preparing to leave the medical facility, Schiller approached Washington hesitantly. She spoke in German quietly, looking at the floor. Bauer, still present, translated. "She says thank you," Bauer said, "for helping her when she collapsed." Washington nodded to Schiller, offered a small smile. "You are welcome," he said, and Bauer translated. The moment stretched out, awkward but significant. Schiller looked up briefly, met Washington's eyes, then looked away quickly. But in that moment something had shifted. Not much. Not enough to overcome years of indoctrination, but enough to create a crack in the wall of propaganda through which truth might eventually seep. The women were escorted to their assigned barracks, a building that had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared. Bunk beds with clean mattresses and blankets, adequate sanitation facilities, windows that actually closed. It was more comfortable than anywhere they had been for weeks. Food was brought, army rations supplemented with items from the German supplies captured in recent weeks. The portions were adequate, the quality acceptable. The women ate in silence, exhausted beyond words. That night in the barracks they talked, voices in the darkness, processing what they had experienced. Brandt, who had the most education and the sharpest analytical mind, tried to make sense of it. "They did not harm us," she said quietly. "We were completely at their mercy, and they did not harm us." "That does not mean anything yet," another woman replied. "They may have plans. We have only been here 1 day." "The one who fainted," someone else said. "The black soldier who helped her, he was gentle. I saw it. He could have done anything, and he was just trying to help." "It is a trick," another voice insisted. "They are trying to make us comfortable before something worse happens. We must not be fooled." But Hoffman, lying on her bunk, was not sure anymore. She had seen Washington's face when Schiller collapsed, had seen genuine concern there. She had watched him work with the nurse, professional and efficient. She had noticed his hands, how careful they were. None of it matched what she had been taught, and the dissonance troubled her deeply. Over the next 3 days, a routine established itself. The prisoners were organized into work details, basic maintenance of their own living area, helping in the kitchen, laundry duties. It was light work, designed to give them structure and purpose, rather than to exploit their labor. Black American soldiers supervised these details, maintaining security while the women worked. Washington found himself supervising a kitchen detail that included Hoffman and Brandt. The kitchen was in a separate building, a large space with industrial stoves and preparation areas. The work was simple: helping prepare vegetables for the evening meal, washing dishes, basic cleaning. A German-speaking soldier was present to translate instructions, but as the days passed, simple communication began to develop, even without translation. Washington demonstrated how he wanted potatoes peeled, showing the technique with his own hands on a potato and a knife. The women watched, then imitated. He checked their work, nodded approval when it was done correctly, gently corrected when needed. His corrections were never harsh, never demeaning. He treated them as people learning a new task, nothing more complicated than that. On the 3rd day, Hoffman cut her finger while working. It was not a serious injury, just a slice across her fingertip from a paring knife, but it bled more than she expected. She gasped, more from surprise than pain, and Washington immediately noticed. He grabbed a clean cloth from a nearby shelf, approached her carefully. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving her time to process what was happening. He held out the cloth, gestured to her hand. "May I?" his gesture asked, though he spoke no German and she no English. Hoffman hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse, to pull away. But the blood was dripping onto the table, and she needed help, and he was offering it with such obvious kindness that refusing seemed churlish. She extended her hand, trembling. Washington took her hand gently, his dark fingers contrasting with her pale skin. He wrapped the cloth around her fingertip, applied light pressure to stop the bleeding. His touch was warm, careful, utterly human. Hoffman found herself staring at their hands together, his holding hers, and the propaganda shattered like glass struck with a hammer. His skin was just skin, warm and human, and no different in any way that mattered from her own. The contact did not burn, did not contaminate, did not harm. It was simply one person helping another, the most basic form of human connection. And with that touch, years of lies began to crumble. "Let me get the first aid kit," Washington said, though she did not understand the words. He released her hand, returned moments later with a proper medical kit. He cleaned the cut with an antiseptic solution that stung, and Hoffman hissed in pain. "Sorry," Washington said, and though the word was English, its meaning was clear in his apologetic tone. He worked quickly, applied a bandage, secured it carefully. "There," he said, examining his work with satisfaction. "All done." Hoffman looked at the bandage, then at Washington. "Thank you," she said in German, knowing he would not understand the words but hoping he would understand the meaning. Washington smiled, nodded. "You are welcome," he replied in English. Brandt had watched the entire interaction with intense focus. She was grappling with her own cognitive dissonance, her own recognition that everything she had been taught about racial hierarchy was demonstrably false. She was intelligent enough to recognize the implications, the way this one small act of kindness undermined the entire ideological structure she had lived within for 12 years. That evening, Brandt asked to speak with Lieutenant Hoffman through the interpreter system established in the camp. Hoffman arrived at the barracks, curious about what she wanted. "I need to understand something," Brandt said in German. "We were told things about these soldiers, about black Americans. We were told they were dangerous, barely human. But everything I have seen contradicts this. Why?" Hoffman considered how to answer. "What you were told was propaganda," he said finally. "Lies designed to make you hate and fear. The men you are encountering here are soldiers of the United States Army. They are as human as anyone else. And most of them are better men than many white soldiers I have known. They have been treated poorly in their own country, denied rights and respect they have earned, and yet they serve with dignity and professionalism. Does that answer your question?" Brandt was silent for a long moment. "It raises more questions than it answers," she said. "But yes, I think I understand." The breakthrough moment came on the 5th day. The camp had received a shipment of additional supplies, including some recreational items donated by various relief organizations. Among these were musical instruments, a guitar, a harmonica, some percussion instruments. Captain Jensen, believing that entertainment would improve morale for both prisoners and soldiers, authorized the establishment of a recreation period in the evenings. Hayes, the former teacher who played guitar reasonably well, retrieved the instrument from the supply room. That evening, as the women's work details finished and they had free time before dinner, Hayes sat on the steps of the administration building and began to play. He started with blues, the music of his community, songs about hardship and endurance and hope. The music drifted across the camp. The German women in their barracks area heard it. Music was a universal language, and Hayes played well, his fingers finding melodies that spoke to something deeper than words or propaganda. Several women drifted toward the sound, curious despite their wariness. Mitchell had a harmonica, and he joined Hayes, adding a second voice to the music. The two had played together before, on long evenings in France when the supply convoys had completed their runs and soldiers sought comfort in familiar rhythms. They played from memory and from the heart, not performing but simply sharing something beautiful in a world that had seen too much ugliness. More women approached, drawn by the music. They kept their distance, sitting on the ground or standing in small groups, But they listened. And as they listened, they began to recognize something fundamental. These men felt the same emotions, expressed them through the same universal medium of music. The blues spoke of pain and struggle, themes the German women understood intimately in this spring of defeat and uncertainty. Washington watched from a distance, leaning against a building, and saw the transformation beginning. The women's faces showed concentration, appreciation, even enjoyment. The fear was still present, but it was being slowly overwhelmed by recognition of shared humanity. After several songs, Hayes transitioned to something different. He began playing a folk song, something simpler and more universally accessible. Mitchell switched to whistling the melody, and the tune floated through the camp like a peace offering. Schiller, the young woman who had fainted that first day, found herself humming along. She caught herself, stopped abruptly, embarrassed. But Hoffman, standing beside her, smiled slightly and began humming too. Then Brandt joined in. And soon a small group of German women were providing harmonies to music, played by Black American soldiers, and in that moment, the barriers seemed less solid, the divisions less absolute. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence. Then Schiller did something extraordinary. She approached Hayes slowly, wringing her hands with nervousness, and spoke in German. Another prisoner who spoke some English translated. "She asks if you know the song Lili Marleen," the woman said. "It was popular during the conflict, with soldiers on all sides." Hayes nodded, smiled. "I know it," he said. He began to play, and his fingers found the melody that German soldiers had sung, that British soldiers had sung, that Americans had sung, a song about longing and loss and the hope of reunion that transcended national boundaries. The German women joined in immediately, their voices rising in the German lyrics. And for the length of that song, they were not prisoners and guards, not victors and vanquished, not divided by race or nation or ideology. They were simply people, sharing a moment of beauty in a broken world. When the song ended, Schiller did something even more remarkable. She reached out and touched Hayes's shoulder, just briefly, a gesture of thanks. Then she realized what she had done and jerked her hand back, shocked at herself. But the touch had occurred, and she had not been struck down, had not been contaminated, had suffered no consequence except the recognition that she had been lied to all her life. Over the next week, the transformation accelerated. The women worked alongside the American soldiers more comfortably. Conversations began to develop, facilitated by the German-speaking soldiers who served as translators. The women asked questions, tentatively at first, then with increasing boldness. "What is America like? Why did you come to Europe? Do you have families back home?" The answers they received painted a picture utterly different from the propaganda they had been fed. Washington found himself in an unexpected conversation with Hoffman one afternoon while supervising a work detail. Through an interpreter, she asked him about his home, and he told her about Alabama, about growing up in a place where racial separation was enforced by law and custom, where opportunities were limited by the color of one's skin. He told her about his father's carpentry shop, about learning the trade, about the pride of creating something beautiful with his own hands. "But you fight for this country," Hoffman said through the translator, confused, "even though you are treated this way." Washington was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something complex and contradictory. "It is my country too," he said finally. "Not just in words, but in truth. My ancestors built it, their forced labor, but their labor nonetheless. I have as much right to it as anyone, and I believe it can be better, that it should be better. Fighting against tyranny here is part of fighting for justice everywhere, even at home." The translator conveyed this, and Hoffman was silent, processing. Then she said something that surprised Washington. "I think I understand," she said. "You fight not just against an enemy, but for an ideal that has not yet been realized. We fought for an ideal too, but ours was based on lies. Yours might actually be true." The conversation marked a turning point. Hoffman became something of a leader among the German women, speaking openly about her changing understanding, encouraging others to question what they had been taught. It was not easy for her. Admitting one has been deceived so thoroughly requires remarkable courage, but she possessed that courage, and she used it. Mitchell, meanwhile, had struck up an unexpected friendship with a German woman named Anna Weber, who had served as a technical specialist maintaining communication equipment. Weber was mechanically inclined, and Mitchell's reputation as a skilled mechanic had reached her. Through an interpreter, they began discussing technical topics: engine repair, electrical systems, the intricacies of maintaining equipment under difficult conditions. The conversation was entirely professional, focused on their shared interest in how machines worked, but it built a bridge of mutual respect. One afternoon, Mitchell was working on a temperamental generator that powered part of the camp's electrical system. Weber, observing from a respectful distance, noticed an error in his approach and spoke up. The interpreter conveyed her suggestion that the problem was likely in the voltage regulator rather than the main coil. Mitchell considered this, checked, and found she was right. He looked at Weber with new respect. "That is good thinking," he said. "Want to help me fix it?" Weber hesitated, looked at the black American soldier offering to work alongside her as an equal, and made her choice. She nodded, stepped forward, and together they repaired the generator. Their hands worked in parallel, adjusting settings, testing connections, solving the problem through mutual effort. When the generator roared back to life, they both smiled with the satisfaction of a job well done. "You are good at this," Mitchell said, and the interpreter conveyed his words. "Where did you learn?" "My father was an electrician," Weber replied through translation. "He taught me. I was not supposed to learn such things. People said it was not proper for a woman, but he taught me anyway. He said skill has no gender." "Smart man," Mitchell replied. "My daughter back home. I'm going to make sure she learns whatever she wants to learn. Being told you cannot do something just because of who you are, that is wrong." Weber met his eyes directly, understanding passing between them despite the language barrier. "Yes," she said simply. "That is exactly right." The relationship between the prisoners and their guards continued to evolve. Captain Jensen, observing the changes, noted them in his reports but did not interfere. He recognized that something important was happening, something that might have implications beyond this small camp. Medical examinations continued on a routine basis. Captain Martinez noted that the women's health was improving steadily, with regular meals and adequate rest. But more than physical health, their psychological state was transforming. The terror had disappeared almost entirely. Wariness remained, which was natural, but it was now the normal wariness of prisoners rather than the existential fear they had initially shown. Schiller asked if she could speak with Washington privately through an interpreter. This was unusual, and there was some hesitation about allowing it, but Captain Jensen finally approved a supervised meeting in one of the offices used for prisoner interviews. Schiller sat across a table from Washington, the interpreter beside them. She was nervous, but determined. She spoke in German, pausing frequently to let the interpreter convey her words. "I need to apologize," she began. "When I first saw you, when we first arrived, I was terrified, not because of anything you did, but because of what I had been taught. I believed lies about you, about all black people. I am ashamed of this now. I see how kind you have been, how professional, how human. I want to say I am sorry for judging you based on propaganda rather than on who you actually are." The interpreter conveyed this, and Washington sat back in his chair, absorbing her words. It was not often that white people apologized to him for prejudice. In fact, he could not recall it ever happening before. He took his time formulating his response. "I appreciate your words," he said slowly. "It takes courage to admit being wrong, especially about something so fundamental. I do not hold anger toward you. You were taught lies by people who had power over you, in a system that punished questioning. The same thing happens in my country. Different lies, but the same result: division and hatred based on things that do not matter. The fact that you can see past the lies now, that is what is important." Schiller listened to the translation, nodded. She reached across the table slowly, giving him time to react. She extended her hand for a handshake, a gesture of respect and apology. Washington looked at her hand, understood the significance of the gesture, what it meant for her to deliberately make this physical contact. He reached out and shook her hand firmly. Their hands clasped for a moment, and Schiller smiled for the first time since becoming a prisoner. It was a small smile, tentative but genuine. When they released hands, she looked down at her palm as if expecting to see some visible mark of the contact. There was nothing, of course, just her own hand, unchanged except by the knowledge it had touched someone she had been taught to fear and found only humanity there. As May progressed, the camp settled into routines that seemed almost normal if one could ignore the unusual circumstances. The war in Europe ended officially on the 8th of May, 1945. News of the surrender reached the camp quickly, spread through both guards and prisoners. The reaction was complex. Relief that the dying was over, uncertainty about what came next. For the prisoners, a profound grief at the totality of defeat. The German women gathered in their barracks that evening, processing the news. Some cried openly, others sat in stunned silence. Brandt spoke, her voice carrying authority. "It is over," she said. "Everything we believed, everything we worked for, it has ended in complete defeat. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the ideas we served deserve to die. I think after these weeks here I am beginning to understand that the defeat was necessary, that what we were part of was fundamentally wrong. Not everyone agreed. A few of the women still held on to their beliefs, though even they had been shaken by their experiences. But the majority had reached the same conclusion Brandt voiced, that they had been part of something evil, and that its ending, however painful, was a form of justice. Washington and the other soldiers of his unit received news of their own. They would remain at the camp for several more weeks, assisting with the continued processing of prisoners before being rotated to other duties. Some hoped for quick assignment home. Others expected to be sent to the Pacific, where the conflict against Japan continued with undiminished intensity. All were tired, ready for military service to end, ready to resume civilian lives. But the weeks they spent at that prisoner processing camp would remain with them forever. They had participated in something unusual, something that had demonstrated truths about human nature and the power of direct personal contact to overcome even deeply implanted prejudice. Hayes continued to hold evening music sessions. They became more elaborate, with German women contributing their own songs, teaching the Americans folk melodies from their homeland. Mitchell taught Weber more about mechanics, and she proved an excellent student. Washington supervised work details and found himself having increasingly sophisticated conversations, facilitated by interpreters, with several of the German women about life, belief, change, and hope. One afternoon, Captain Jensen called Washington into his office. Jensen had a letter in his hand, an official document with multiple stamps and signatures. "Washington," Jensen said, "I have been asked to submit reports on how this unusual assignment has proceeded. I want you to know that I have written very positively about how you and the other men have conducted yourselves. You have been professional, compassionate, and you have represented the Army and your country with distinction." "Thank you, sir," Washington replied, wondering where this was going. Jensen hesitated, then continued. "I am also going to recommend you for promotion to corporal, and I am going to write a separate letter to be included in your permanent file, detailing your conduct here. I cannot promise anything, but I hope that when this conflict is over and you return home, this record might help, might make a small difference." Washington understood what Jensen was trying to do, appreciated the gesture, even as he recognized its probable futility. A letter in a military file would not change segregation laws, would not overcome the systematic discrimination he would face back home. But it was something, a small recognition, and he accepted it gracefully. "I appreciate that, sir," Washington said. "If nothing else, I will know I did my job well." "You did more than that," Jensen said quietly. "You changed minds, opened eyes. That is no small accomplishment." As the weeks passed and June arrived, the time came for many of the prisoners to be transferred to longer-term facilities where they would await final repatriation. The women Washington had worked most closely with would be among the first group transferred, scheduled to depart on the 15th of June. The day before their departure, Hoffman asked through an interpreter if she could give Washington something. It was a small carved wooden figure, a simple but beautifully crafted bird. Hoffman explained that her brother had carved it before the conflict, that it was one of her few remaining possessions, and that she wanted Washington to have it as a thank you and a remembrance. Washington was touched by the gesture but hesitant to accept. "This is too much," he said. It is a personal treasure, a memory of your family. You should keep it." Hoffman shook her head firmly. "Please," she said through the interpreter, "you helped change how I see the world. You treated me with kindness when I had been taught to see you as less than human. This is a small thing compared to that gift. Take it, and remember that people can change, that propaganda can be overcome." Washington accepted the carving, held it carefully. His own hands were scarred from years of work, but they handled the delicate wooden bird as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I will keep this always," he said, "and I will remember. Thank you." The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the women to their next destination. There was an awkwardness to the departure, prisoners saying goodbye to their guards, acknowledging relationships that had developed, despite all the reasons they should not have. Schiller hugged Weber, both women crying openly. Brandt shook hands with Mitchell, then with Hayes, then with Washington, each handshake deliberate and meaningful. Hoffman simply nodded to Washington, understanding passing between them without need for words. As the trucks pulled away, Washington stood with the other soldiers, watching them disappear down the road. The camp felt emptier, quieter. Something significant had occurred here, though its full meaning would take time to understand. "Life is strange," Mitchell said quietly. "A few weeks ago those women thought we were monsters. Now they leave as if we were friends. Makes you wonder what else people believe that is just as wrong." "Makes you wonder," Washington agreed. He touched the pocket where he had placed the wooden bird, felt its solid presence there. "Makes you wonder if maybe the world could be different if enough people learned the same lesson." The camp continued operations for another month. New prisoners came and went, processed through the same routines. But the profound personal transformations of those first weeks did not repeat. They had been unique, the result of specific circumstances and specific individuals coming together at a specific moment in history. On the 20th of July, 1945, Washington's unit received orders. They were being rotated back to France, then to a staging area in preparation for transport home. The conflict with Japan had ended abruptly with the use of atomic weapons, events so overwhelming that their implications would take years to fully comprehend. But the immediate impact was clear. The fighting was truly over. The soldiers would go home. The journey back across France, then across the Atlantic Ocean, then finally home to America took weeks. Washington had time to think about everything he had experienced, about the war, about the prisoner camp, about the German women whose fear had transformed to understanding through simple human contact. He arrived back in Alabama in September of 1945, was discharged in October, and returned to his father's carpentry shop. The town was unchanged. The same racial separation, the same limitations, the same ingrained prejudices. He had fought across Europe, had helped defeat tyranny, had demonstrated through his conduct that the supposed racial hierarchies were lies. None of it mattered here. He still had to enter through the back door of shops, still could not vote, still lived under a system designed to keep him subordinate. But something had changed inside him. The experience at that prisoner camp had shown him that even deeply implanted prejudices could be overcome, that direct human contact could shatter propaganda's grip. If German women who had spent 12 years immersed in extreme racial ideology could learn to see past it in a matter of weeks, then surely his own country could change too, given time and effort and countless small moments of human connection. He kept the wooden bird on his workbench, a reminder. When customers asked about it, he told them it was a gift from someone who had learned to see past lies. Most did not understand or pretended not to, but occasionally someone would ask more, and Washington would tell a version of the story, carefully edited to be palatable to his audience, and perhaps in the telling he planted seeds that might someday grow into greater understanding. Mitchell returned to Detroit and his family, his wife and daughter, who had waited faithfully through long years of separation. He went back to work at the automobile factory. He taught his daughter mechanics, just as he had promised, and she grew up believing that skill had no gender, no race, only dedication and practice. Mitchell told her stories of the conflict, including stories of German women who had learned to question what they had been taught, hoping she would learn the lesson. Always examined beliefs, especially those that justify treating others as less than human. Hayes returned to Philadelphia and to teaching. He used his experience to inform how he taught history, emphasizing the importance of questioning propaganda, of seeking truth beyond comfortable narratives. He published his diary in 1947, a small run printed by a local press. The book sold modestly, but received some positive attention for its honest portrayal of a black soldier's experience in the segregated army. A few pages were devoted to his time at the prisoner processing camp, to the German women who had overcome their conditioning, and to the power of music to build bridges. The German women returned to their homes, to a destroyed Germany, to the difficult work of rebuilding both their nation and their understanding of the world. Hoffman wrote to Washington once, a letter that reached him months after it was sent, having traveled through the uncertain postal systems of post-conflict Europe and America. She told him she was working to rebuild, that her family had survived, and that she thought often of those weeks in the prisoner camp, where she had learned the most important lesson of her life, that human dignity transcends all artificial categories of race or nation or ideology. Brandt, with her education and capability, became involved in the reconstruction efforts, working in administration. She spoke openly about her time as a prisoner, about the black American soldiers who had treated her with respect and humanity when they could have done otherwise. Some people did not want to hear it, preferred to maintain their prejudices even in defeat. But others listened, and perhaps those listeners became part of the slow transformation of German society in the post-conflict years. Schiller married in 1948, moved to a small village, raised children, and lived a quiet life. But she told her children stories about the conflict, including the story of collapsing in fear and being helped by a black American soldier whose kindness had shattered everything she thought she knew about the world. She told them to never accept claims of superiority or inferiority based on race or religion or nationality, to judge people by their actions and character, to remember that propaganda is powerful, but truth is stronger. Weber used her technical skills to find work in the rebuilding efforts, eventually becoming one of the few women engineers in Germany in the 1950s. When people questioned whether a woman should be doing such work, she thought of Mitchell teaching her generator repair, treating her as an equal, and she refused to be limited by others' prejudices. She never married, devoted herself to her career, and became a mentor to younger women entering technical fields. Captain Jensen remained in the army, serving through the Cold War years. He wrote extensively about his experiences, including detailed reports about the prisoner processing camp and the unexpected transformation that had occurred there. His writings contributed to discussions about racial integration in the military, though change came slowly and against fierce resistance. Jensen retired as a colonel in 1959 and spent his later years advocating for civil rights, crediting his experiences in that small German camp with opening his eyes to the realities of American racial prejudice. Captain Martinez continued her nursing career, both in military and civilian contexts. She specialized in trauma care and became known for her insistence that all patients be treated with equal care, regardless of race, religion, or national origin. When asked why this principle was so important to her, she would reference her time in Germany, watching black soldiers treat former enemy prisoners with professional compassion, and the lesson it taught her about human dignity. The prisoner processing camp itself was closed in August of 1945. Its buildings returned to whatever purpose they would serve in the new Germany. The physical structure disappeared into history, but the events that occurred there rippled outward, touching lives, changing perspectives, contributing in small ways to larger transformations. The story of what happened in that camp was not unique. Similar moments of human connection occurred in countless locations across the chaos of post-conflict Europe. But each instance mattered. Each small victory over prejudice contributed to eventual larger changes. The German women who touched black soldiers' skin and discovered it was simply skin, warm and human, carried that knowledge forward. The black soldiers who treated former enemies with dignity, even while facing discrimination in their own country, demonstrated a moral authority that could not be dismissed. Washington lived until 1987, long enough to see the civil rights movement transform American society, though not long enough to see the full realization of equality he had fought for. The wooden bird remained on his workbench through decades of carpentry work, a reminder of that spring in 1945, when human contact had proven stronger than propaganda. He never met Hoffman again after her departure from the camp, but he thought of her often, wondered about her life, hoped she had found peace and purpose. In his final years, Washington gave interviews to historians documenting the experiences of black soldiers in the conflict. He spoke about the segregation, the discrimination, the denial of opportunities. But he also spoke about that prisoner camp, about the German women whose terror transformed to understanding, about the power of simple human kindness to overcome even deeply implanted hatred. He hoped that the story would help people understand something important about human nature, that prejudice is learned and can therefore be unlearned. That direct personal contact is the most powerful antidote to bigotry. That touch, the most basic form of human connection, can shatter walls that ideology builds. The historians who interviewed Washington asked if he felt bitter about his treatment, about serving a country that denied him equal rights. Washington considered the question carefully before answering. Bitter. Sometimes, he said. Frustrated? Often. But I also learned something important. I learned that people can change, that even the most vicious propaganda can be overcome. Those German women, they believed things about me that were even worse than what some white Americans believed, and they changed completely in a matter of weeks. If they could change, anyone can. That gives me hope. The struggle for justice is long, but it is not hopeless. That hope, hard-won through difficult experience, was perhaps the most important lesson of that spring in 1945. The moment when German women prisoners of war touched a black soldier's skin for the first time and discovered he was simply human was not just about individual transformation. It was a demonstration of a universal truth, that the categories we use to divide humanity are artificial constructs, that skin color is simply a visible but ultimately meaningless variation in melanin production, that every attempt to build hierarchies of human worth based on race or ethnicity or religion is built on lies that crumble when confronted with direct human contact. The broader historical implications of these individual transformations would unfold over decades. The experience of black soldiers in the conflict contributed to the push for military integration, achieved in 1948, when President Truman issued Executive Order 9981. The stories they brought back contributed to the growing civil rights movement, providing evidence that racial prejudice was not immutable human nature, but learned behavior that could be challenged and changed. The German women who had experienced these transformations became part of the generation that rebuilt Germany and, in doing so, rejected the racial ideology that had brought their nation to ruin. Their children and grandchildren grew up in a society that, while not perfect, had learned through devastating defeat that ideologies built on racial hierarchy lead only to destruction. The lessons were painful but necessary. The wooden bird that Hoffman had given Washington was eventually donated to a museum focusing on World War II history, along with letters and diary entries documenting the story behind it. It sits now in a display case, a small carved figure representing a larger truth, that human beings are capable of transcending the prejudices they are taught, that fear can transform to understanding, that even in the darkest moments of history there are lights of human decency that refuse to be extinguished. Visitors to the museum read the placard explaining the bird's history, learn about the prisoner processing camp, about the soldiers and the prisoners whose brief intersection created moments of profound transformation. Some visitors understand immediately the significance of the story. Others take time to process it, to recognize the layers of meaning, the irony of black soldiers fighting to defeat racial tyranny while living under racial oppression, the courage required for both the soldiers to show compassion and the prisoners to accept it, the power of simple human contact to shatter propaganda's grip. The story resonates because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. We are all shaped by the beliefs we are taught, by the propaganda we absorb, by the ideologies that structure our societies. But we are also capable of transcending those teachings when confronted with direct human contact that contradicts what we have been told. a hand extended in kindness, a touch that proves warmth rather than threat, a moment of recognition that the person we feared is simply another human being struggling with their own fears and hopes. These moments have the power to change minds and hearts in ways that arguments and evidence alone cannot achieve. The German women who touched black soldiers' skin for the first time and discovered their own humanity, reflected back at them, carried that lesson forward into changed lives. The black soldiers who extended compassion to former enemies while denied dignity in their own country demonstrated a moral courage that still resonates. And the historian today, examining that small wooden bird in its display case, can trace the lines of connection from that brief encounter in a makeshift prisoner camp to larger transformations in both German and American society. Change is slow, often painfully so. The year 1945 did not mark the end of racial prejudice in America or Germany or anywhere else. The struggles for justice and equality continued through decades of resistance and setbacks. But every individual transformation matters. Every moment when fear gives way to understanding contributes to eventual larger change. The women who overcame their indoctrination in those weeks at the camp became voices for tolerance in the rebuilding of Germany. The soldiers who maintained their dignity and compassion despite discrimination became part of the movement that eventually achieved civil rights in America. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments.